At my father's funeral, my sister leaned over during the eulogy and whispered, "I've already cleared out Dad's home office and safe. There's nothing left for you." I felt defeated until Dad's old fishing buddy approached me with a weathered envelope. "Your father made me promise to give you this after everyone else had gone," he said. When my sister saw what was inside, her designer sunglasses couldn't hide the shock on her face. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The funeral home smelled of lilies and artificial air freshener, an uncomfortable combination that matched the awkward silence between mourners who hadn't seen each other in years. My father, Richard Hanover, deserved better than this sterile room with its generic paintings and hushed conversations. He had been larger than life, a self-made businessman who built a commercial construction company from nothing, a man whose laugh could fill a room, whose advice was sought by everyone from local politicians to neighborhood kids. Now he was gone, reduced to ashes in an ornate urn at the front of the room, surrounded by photographs that couldn't possibly capture his essence. I stood near the back, accepting condolences from people whose names I barely remembered. My sister Victoria circulated through the crowd with practiced grace, her designer black dress and perfectly styled hair making my department store outfit feel even more inadequate. She had always been better at appearances. "Thomas, there you are." Victoria's voice carried just enough warmth to seem appropriate for the occasion, but I recognized the coolness underneath. We had never been close, but since Dad's diagnosis, the distance had grown into something more like animosity. "Senator Wilkins was asking about you. You should say hello." "I will," I said, though we both knew I wouldn't. Politics had been Victoria's world, not mine. I had chosen to stay in our hometown, working alongside Dad in the family business while Victoria had moved to the state capital, married well, and built connections with people who could afford to donate to campaigns and sit on charity boards. The service was brief. Dad had been specific about that in his final months. No long eulogies, no dramatic displays of grief. Just a simple gathering to mark his passing. Victoria spoke anyway, delivering a polished speech about our father's community contributions and business acumen that somehow managed to reference her own accomplishments and connections throughout. I said nothing publicly. My grief felt too raw, too personal to perform for this audience. After the service, as people began to disperse toward their cars for the short drive to the cemetery, Victoria pulled me aside, her manicured fingers digging slightly into my arm. "We need to discuss the estate," she said, her voice low. "I've already spoken with Harrison." Harrison Fleming had been Dad's attorney for decades. "There's really not much to handle. Dad's health bills took most of what was left." I frowned. "Dad's company is worth millions, Victoria, and the house was remortgaged to pay for his treatments," she finished, adjusting her sunglasses. "As for the company, Dad sold his controlling interest 3 years ago. Didn't he tell you?" The question landed like a slap. Of course Dad hadn't told me. I would have known if he had sold the company where I worked as operations manager. I had been in budget meetings just last month, reviewing expansion plans with Dad's approval. "You're lying," I said, the words escaping before I could soften them. Victoria's smile tightened. "Check the records if you don't believe me. The remaining shares and assets are being distributed according to Dad's wishes." She leaned closer, her perfume momentarily overwhelming the floral scents around us. "I've already cleared out Dad's home office and safe. There's nothing left for you." She walked away, joining a group of Dad's business associates who waited by a black SUV, leaving me stunned and confused. It didn't make sense. Dad and I had spoken about the future of Hanover construction just weeks ago, discussing plans for me to eventually take over leadership. He had given no indication that he'd sold his stake or changed his long-standing intention to pass the company to me. The graveside service passed in a blur, I stood apart from Victoria and her husband, Charles, watching as they received condolences with practiced poise. Several of Dad's employees nodded respectfully in my direction, their expressions conveying both sympathy and uncertainty. They had questions I couldn't answer. As the crowd thinned, I found myself standing alone by the fresh grave. The cemetery. Workers waited at a discreet distance, ready to complete their work once the family departed. I wasn't ready to leave. "Thought I might find you still here," a gruff voice said behind me. I turned to see Frank Carpenter, my father's oldest friend. They had served in the military together decades ago and had remained close ever since. Frank was the kind of man who seemed perpetually weathered. Tanned skin, calloused hands, eyes that had seen too much but still managed to retain warmth. "Frank," I acknowledged, accepting his firm handshake. "Thank you for coming." "Wouldn't be anywhere else," he said simply. "Your dad was the best man I ever knew." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, both looking down at the urn that contained all that remained physically of Richard Hanover. "Victoria says Dad sold the company," I finally said. "Says there's nothing left." Frank's expression darkened. "Did she now?" "Is it true?" I asked, searching his face for answers. Frank glanced around, ensuring we were truly alone. "Your sister's been saying a lot of things since Rich got sick, showing up at his house with documents, having private meetings with attorneys." He shook his head slightly. "Your dad wasn't happy about it." "What do you mean?" Frank sighed heavily. "Not my place to get between family. But Rich asked me to give you something. Made me promise to wait until after the funeral, after everyone else had gone." He reached into his worn sport coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. It looked ordinary, just a standard business envelope, yellowed slightly with age, with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. "What is this?" I asked, taking it carefully. "Don't know exactly," Frank admitted. "He sealed it about 6 months ago, right after his diagnosis got serious. Said if anything happened to him before he could talk to you himself, I was to make sure you got this privately." He squeezed my shoulder. "Whatever's going on with Victoria and the company, your dad thought this would help sort it out." Before I could ask more questions, Victoria's voice called from the parking area. "Thomas, we're heading to the house. Now, people will be expecting us." Her tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Frank nodded toward the envelope. "Read it when you're alone," he advised quietly. Rich was worried about who might be watching. I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket, thanked Frank, and made my way toward the small procession of cars heading to my father's house. The house I had grown up in. The house Victoria now implied had been mortgaged away without my knowledge. The reception was as uncomfortable as the funeral. Our father's home, once warm and lived in, had already been partially cleared out. Family photographs were missing from the walls, his collection of military memorabilia gone from the shelves in the den. Victoria presided over the gathering like she owned the place, which, according to her, she effectively did. I circulated on autopilot, the envelope in my pocket seeming to grow heavier with each passing minute. Several times I noticed Victoria watching me with barely disguised suspicion. Once her husband Charles cornered me by the food table, making pointed comments about how difficult these transitions could be and how important it was to respect the deceased's wishes without causing family discord. The message was clear. Don't make trouble. By late afternoon, my patience had worn thin. I slipped out to the backyard, seeking a moment of peace in the garden my father had tended so carefully. Even here, signs of neglect were evident. Wilting plants that hadn't been watered, weeds beginning to encroach on the once immaculate beds. Dad had only been gone 3 weeks, but Victoria's disinterest in preserving his personal passions was already apparent. I sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree and finally withdrew the envelope from my pocket. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small key with a numbered tag attached. The note was brief, written in my father's increasingly shaky handwriting. Thomas, if you're reading this, then things have happened as I feared they might. Victoria has been pressuring me to sign over assets, claiming it's for estate planning. I've stalled as long as I could. The key opens safe deposit box 247 at First National downtown. Go alone. The contents will explain everything and provide what you need. Trust no one except Frank and Eleanor Jenkins at the bank. Whatever Victoria has told you, know this. You were always meant to carry on the Hanover legacy. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this. Dad, I read the note 3 times, my confusion giving way to a cold anger. Whatever game Victoria was playing, Dad had anticipated it, and he had prepared a countermove. The key felt small, but significant in my palm. Tomorrow, I would visit First National Bank and discover what my father had hidden away. For now, I carefully refolded the note, returned it to the envelope, and slipped both back into my pocket. When I re-entered the house, Victoria was dismissing the catering staff. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrow with suspicion. "Where did you disappear to?" she asked. "Just needed some air," I replied, working to keep my expression neutral. "Dad's garden is looking rough." She waved a dismissive hand. "The house will be on the market next week. No point in maintaining landscaping that new owners will just change anyway." "So soon?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "No reason to wait," she said briskly. "The estate needs to be settled quickly." Her eyes flicked to my pocket, where the outline of the envelope was just visible. "What's that?" I resisted the urge to touch it. "Just some notes from well-wishers. I'll be heading out now." "Thomas," she called as I turned to leave. "I know this is difficult, but fighting the inevitable only makes things harder. Dad made his choices about the business and the estate. We should respect them." I met her gaze steadily. "I couldn't agree more, Victoria. We should absolutely respect Dad's true wishes." Something in my tone must have alerted her. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she composed herself again. "I'll be in touch about the remaining arrangements," she said. "There isn't much to distribute, but we'll need to formalize everything." I nodded and walked out, the key burning in my pocket like a promise. Tomorrow would bring answers, and possibly a reckoning that Victoria wasn't prepared for. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I hardly slept that night. The envelope and key rested on my nightstand, illuminated by the occasional headlights passing outside my apartment window. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Victoria's face, not as it had been at the funeral, composed and calculating, but as it had been when we were children, before the distance between us grew into a chasm. There had been a time when we were close. Victoria, 4 years my senior, had once been my protector and guide. I remembered her teaching me to ride a bike down our steep driveway, holding the seat until I found my balance, cheering when I finally managed without her help. I remembered sharing secrets in the treehouse Dad built us, planning adventures we never took, imagining our adult lives with the boundless optimism of children who hadn't yet learned about disappointment. When did it change? The question haunted me as I stared at the ceiling, reconstructing our history for clues. Perhaps it began when our mother left. Victoria was 12, I was 8. Mom had been gradually withdrawing for months, emotional, absences that preceded her physical departure. She had married Dad expecting a comfortable life as the wife of a promising young contractor, not the endless work hours and financial stress of those early years building the business. By the time Hanover construction finally turned profitable, something essential in her had already withered. Victoria blamed Dad. I blamed myself. Neither of us was right, but our divergent responses to that abandonment set us on different paths. I threw myself into becoming Dad's perfect son, his legacy and companion. I learned the construction business, from the ground up, spending summers on job sites from age 14, studying business in college specifically to help expand Hanover construction. My choices were always filtered through one question. Would this make Dad proud? Victoria took the opposite approach. She distanced herself from anything Dad valued, pursuing interests that would take her far from our hometown and the family. Business. She excelled in debate and political science, attended an expensive East Coast university on scholarship, and cultivated relationships with people whose influence could advance her ambitions. She visited rarely and called even less. Dad didn't know how to bridge the gap with his daughter. He tried clumsy gestures, paying for her wedding to Charles despite his concerns about the man's character, offering to finance her first campaign for city council, sending generous checks on birthdays and Christmas. Victoria accepted these gifts with cool gratitude but never reciprocated with what Dad truly wanted, her time and affection. I became the repository of all Dad's hopes and plans. "Someday this will all be yours," he would say, gesturing around the Hanover construction offices. "You'll build it even bigger, make the name mean even more." I accepted this responsibility willingly, even eagerly. The company was more than a business to me. It was our shared creation, the tangible proof of our bond. The first serious fracture between Victoria and me occurred after Dad's 65th birthday, 5 years ago. He had decided, with my encouragement, not to retire but to begin transitioning leadership to me. The announcement was made at a company celebration with Victoria and Charles in attendance as rare guests. "I've never seen anyone look at a cake with such hatred," Frank had commented afterward, nodding toward Victoria's rigid posture at the corner table. "Like your dad just announced he was giving you her inheritance." "That's ridiculous," I had replied. "Victoria has never wanted anything to do with the company. She's built her own life, her own career." Frank had given me a long look. "There's a difference between not wanting something and not wanting someone else to have it, son." The memory of that conversation took on new significance as I lay in bed, the key to safe deposit box number 247, catching occasional glints of streetlight. Had Victoria spent the last 5 years nurturing resentment, waiting for an opportunity? Dad's illness would have provided the perfect opening. A vulnerable man, worried about his legacy, perhaps easily manipulated by a daughter suddenly showing interest and concern. But Dad had been sharp until the end. His body had failed him, but his mind remained clear and calculating. He had built a company from nothing, navigated countless business challenges, outmaneuvered competitors who underestimated him. If he suspected Victoria was planning something, he would have prepared countermeasures. The safe deposit box was proof of that. I rose before dawn, showered, and dressed in one of my better suits. First National opened at 9, but I arrived at 8:30, parking across the street and watching the employees arrive. I didn't know who might be reporting to Victoria. Small towns harbor divided loyalties, and Hanover was a significant name in our community. At 9:15, I entered the bank, approaching a middle-aged woman whose nameplate read, Eleanor Jenkins, branch manager. "Mr. Hanover," she greeted me professionally, showing no surprise at my presence. "My condolences on your loss. Your father was a valued client." "Thank you, Ms. Jenkins," I replied. "I believe he mentioned you might be able to assist me with a private matter." A flicker of understanding crossed her face. She glanced around the lobby, then nodded toward a hallway. "Let's speak in my office." The space was modestly appointed but private, with blinds that she promptly closed after we entered. She took a seat behind her desk, folding her hands in front of her. "Your father indicated you might be visiting," she said without preamble. "He was concerned about confidentiality." I withdrew the key from my pocket and placed it on her desk. "Safe deposit box, 247. She nodded once. "I'll take you to the vault myself. I should mention that your sister visited 3 days ago, requesting access to your father's accounts and safe deposit box. My heart jumped. Did she gain access? To the accounts where she was already a signatory, yes. To the safe deposit box. A small professional smile touched her lips. We explained that we had no record of a box under Richard Hanover's name accessible to Victoria Hanover Reed. But box Thumrevere 247 exists, I confirmed. Indeed it does, under a different registration. Arrangement. She stood and gestured for me to follow. The late Mr. Hanover was quite methodical in his planning. The vault area was empty of other customers, for which I was grateful. Eleanor used her credentials to access the room, then directed me to a private booth after locating box W247 with her master key and my key together. Take as much time as you need, she said, closing the door behind her. The metal box was larger than I expected, about the size of a small suitcase. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. On top was a sealed envelope, with "Read First" written in Dad's handwriting. Beneath it lay several folders, a portable hard drive, and what looked like legal documents secured with binder clips. I opened the envelope first. Thomas, if you're reading this, then my concerns were justified. I'm so sorry to burden you with this mess, but you're the only one I can trust to handle it properly. 6 months ago, Victoria began visiting regularly, for the first time in years. At first, I was simply happy to have my daughter back in my life. When she started bringing documents for me to sign, estate planning, she called it, I became suspicious. The paperwork was complex, designed to confuse, and presented when I was often medicated for pain. I pretended to comply while having my own attorney secretly review copies. What I discovered was alarming. Victoria and Charles are in serious financial trouble. His investment firm has been mismanaging client funds, and there are whispers of potential criminal charges. They're desperate for liquid assets to cover their losses. The documents I was pressured to sign would have 1. Transferred controlling interest in Hanover Construction to Victoria. 2. Remortgaged my home with me as sole guarantor. 3. Changed my will to leave all remaining assets to Victoria, with you. Receiving only a token inheritance, I signed versions that appeared identical but contained crucial differences. Documents prepared by my own attorney that Victoria was too hurried or careless to properly review. These counterfeits bought me time. In this box, you'll find my actual will and testament, full documentation of my continued ownership of Hanover Construction, records of Victoria's attempts to defraud me, including recorded conversations, legal in our state with one party, consent, a letter to Harrison Fleming instructing him on how to proceed, a private letter to Victoria that I ask you to deliver personally after the legal matters are settled. This will be difficult, son. Family divisions are the most painful kind, but Hanover Construction represents the livelihoods of over 60 employees and their families. It cannot be sacrificed to cover Charles's misdeeds or Victoria's ambitions. I built this company for you because you loved it as I did. Protect it, lead it with integrity, and if possible, find a way to save your sister from herself. With pride and love, Dad. I read the letter twice, a storm of emotions building within me. Relief that Dad had seen through Victoria's scheme, anger at her betrayal, sorrow for how far she had fallen, and anxiety about the confrontation that inevitably lay ahead. The remaining contents of the box confirmed everything. There were documented transfers showing Dad maintained 85% ownership of Hanover Construction until his death. His will clearly designated me as the inheritor of both the company and the family home, with Victoria receiving a smaller but still generous cash inheritance. Most damning were the recorded conversations, copies stored both on the hard drive and as transcripts. Victoria's voice, calculating and cold, discussing with Charles how they would leverage Dad's condition to gain control of assets before Thomas realizes what's happening. My own sister, plotting to steal my inheritance while our father was dying. The realization felt like a physical blow. The final document in the box was a legal letter to be delivered to Harrison Fleming, Dad's attorney of record. It detailed the false documents Victoria had likely presented to him and instructed him on how to proceed with the genuine will and supporting evidence. I gathered everything into my briefcase, including the portable drive and Dad's sealed letter to Victoria. As I prepared to leave, a heavy responsibility settled over me. This wasn't just about my inheritance now. It was about honoring Dad's wishes, protecting the company and its employees, and somehow navigating the wreckage of family, bonds that might never be repaired. Eleanor Jenkins was waiting when I emerged from the private booth. Her expression was professional but compassionate. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, Mr. Hanover?" she asked. "Yes," I decided. "I'd like to speak with your security team about the surveillance footage from my sister's visit 3 days ago, and I'll need certified documentation confirming when this box was registered and who has had access." She nodded. "Of course. Your father was quite clear about the protocols to follow." As I completed the necessary arrangements, my phone buzzed with a text message from Victoria. "Meeting with Harrison at 2 p.m. to finalize estate matters. Your presence requested but not required." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. In 4 hours, Victoria's carefully constructed facade would crumble, and I would be there to witness it, armed with the truth my father had protected until the very end. The law offices of Fleming and Associates occupied the entire 3rd floor of the town's oldest commercial building, a red brick landmark that Hanover Construction had actually renovated 5 years earlier. I remembered Dad's pride in preserving the historical facade while modernizing the interior infrastructure, a perfect metaphor, he'd said, for how businesses should evolve, honoring their foundations while adapting to changing times. Now, as I rode the elevator up with the evidence secured in my briefcase, those words seemed prophetic in a different way. I was about to honor Dad's true legacy by exposing the deception that threatened to undermine everything he had built. I arrived 30 minutes early for the meeting, a deliberate choice that gave me time to speak privately with Harrison Fleming. His assistant seemed surprised to see me but ushered me directly into his office when I mentioned having important documents regarding Richard Hanover's estate. Harrison rose from behind his imposing mahogany desk, extending his hand. He was in his mid-60s, with the carefully cultivated appearance of distinguished legal counsel. Silver hair, tailored suit, tortoiseshell glasses that he peered over rather than through. "Thomas, my deepest condolences," he began, his handshake firm. "This must be an incredibly difficult time." "Thank you, Harrison," I replied, taking the offered seat across from him. "It's been challenging in ways I never anticipated." Something in my tone must have alerted him. His expression shifted subtly from professional sympathy to cautious assessment. "I understand Victoria has scheduled a meeting to discuss the estate," I continued. "Before that happens, there's something you need to see." I extracted the legal letter Dad had prepared specifically for Harrison, along with the documentation, proving Dad's continued ownership of Hanover Construction. As Harrison reviewed the materials, his professional composure gradually gave way to deep concern. When he reached the transcripts of Victoria's recorded conversations, his eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "This is?" he began, then shook his head, removing his glasses to pinch the bridge of his nose. "Thomas, I had no idea. Victoria presented documents with your father's signature, documents that painted a very different picture of his wishes." "The signatures were likely genuine," I explained. "But according to Dad's letter, the documents were substitutes, similar in appearance but critically different in content." Harrison nodded grimly. "A sophisticated approach. Your father was always several moves ahead." He tapped the papers, thoughtfully. "These recordings are particularly troubling. They suggest not just family discord, but potentially criminal activity." "I don't want to press charges," I said quickly, surprising myself with the certainty of it. Dad wanted the company protected and his true wishes honored, but he also wanted to give Victoria a chance to... I hesitated, remembering Dad's final request to save your sister from herself. To make amends? Harrison suggested. Something like that. Harrison spent the next 20 minutes reviewing all the materials thoroughly, occasionally making notes. Finally, he looked up. His decision apparently made. Here's how we'll proceed. When Victoria arrives, I'll begin by addressing the documents she previously submitted. Then I'll introduce the actual will and supporting evidence. He adjusted his glasses. I suggest you allow me to take the lead. These situations can become volatile. I nodded agreement, both dreading and anticipating the confrontation to come. We spent the remaining time preparing, Harrison occasionally expressing muted outrage at how elaborately Victoria had attempted to manipulate the situation. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Harrison's assistant announced Victoria's arrival. My sister entered, with the confident stride of someone who believed victory was already secured. She wore a tailored gray business suit that probably cost more than most Hanover construction employees made in a month. Her dark hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized her sharp features. Her momentary surprise at seeing me quickly transformed into cool composure. Thomas, I didn't expect you to make it. She set her designer handbag on a chair before taking a seat, crossing her legs elegantly. I was just telling Charles this morning how difficult it must be for you, processing Dad's decisions about the company. Harrison cleared his throat. Before we begin, Mrs. Hanover Reed, I want to clarify something. You provided me with several documents regarding your father's estate planning and business arrangements. Is that correct? Victoria nodded, a slight smile playing at her lips. Yes, documents that Dad signed in my presence over the past several months. I have the originals, if you need to review them again. That won't be necessary, Harrison replied, his tone measured. What will be necessary is explaining why these documents conflict with your father's actual will and business holdings, as registered with multiple legal and financial institutions. The confident smile froze on Victoria's face. I'm not sure... What you mean? Harrison opened a folder, extracting the first of many documents that would dismantle her deception. This is your father's actual will, properly witnessed and notarized 6 months ago. It differs significantly from the version you provided. Victoria's eyes darted from the document to me, calculation visible in her expression. There must be some mistake. Dad revised his will during his illness. I was there. No mistake, I said quietly. Dad left evidence, Victoria. All of it. The recordings, the real documents, everything. Her composure cracked just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stiffening of her shoulders. Recordings? What recordings? Harrison pressed a button on a small digital recorder on his desk. Victoria's voice filled the room. He's heavily medicated after the treatments, Charles. Tuesday afternoons are best. The nurse leaves at 4, and he's usually disoriented enough to sign without reading closely. Just make sure the documents look similar enough to what he's expecting. Harrison stopped the recording. The silence. That followed heavy with implication. Victoria's face had drained of color, but her recovery was impressively quick. That's taken completely out of context. I was protecting Dad from making impulsive decisions while he was ill, including the decision to retain ownership of his company rather than transferring it to you? I asked, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Or the decision to leave his house unencumbered by debt rather than remortgaged to provide you with immediate cash. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You have no idea of the pressures Dad was under, the concerns he had about the company's future under your management. He confided in me, Thomas. Things he couldn't tell you because he didn't want to hurt your feelings. The manipulation was so transparent it almost made me laugh. Almost. Victoria, Harrison interjected, his tone deliberately calm. "I have documentation of your father's explicit intentions regarding both Hanover Construction and his estate, properly executed and legally binding. I also have evidence suggesting you attempted to circumvent those intentions through potentially fraudulent means." He folded his hands. "How we proceed from here depends largely on how you choose to respond today." Victoria's gaze shifted between us, the calculation behind her eyes almost visible. I could practically see her weighing options, assessing what she could still salvage from the situation. "What exactly are you suggesting, Harrison?" she finally asked, her voice perfectly controlled. "I'm suggesting that you acknowledge your father's actual will and estate plans, withdraw any contradictory documents you've submitted, and participate in an orderly, legal settlement of his affairs." He paused meaningfully. "The alternative would involve unpleasant legal proceedings that would benefit no one." Victoria turned to me, her expression hardening. "So this is your play? Threaten me with legal action unless I quietly accept whatever scraps Dad decided to leave me?" "Dad didn't leave you scraps," I replied, opening another folder from my briefcase. "He left you a substantial cash inheritance and his investment portfolio. The house and company come to me because I've dedicated my life to them. But your inheritance is generous by any standard." I slid the summary across the table. All he wanted was for everything he built to continue, not to be liquidated to solve temporary financial problems. Victoria's eyes widened slightly as she reviewed the figures. Even in his anger and disappointment, Dad had provided for her with characteristic generosity. "And what about Charles's situation?" she asked quietly, the first genuine question she'd posed. "These funds won't cover what he needs." So it was true. Charles was in financial or legal trouble, serious enough that they had been willing to destroy family bonds and betray Dad's trust to address it. "That's not Dad's responsibility to solve," I said firmly. "Or mine." Victoria's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her perfect posture. "You don't understand what we're facing, Thomas." "Actually, I do," I countered. Dad's letter explained everything. Charles's firm is under investigation. There are whispers of criminal charges. You needed liquid assets quickly, and Dad's illness seemed like an opportunity. She flinched at the accuracy of my summary, then rallied, her chin lifting defiantly. "It's more complicated than that. Charles was protecting investors. The regulations are impossible." Harrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hanover Reed, I strongly advise against continuing that line of explanation, particularly in my presence. As an officer of the court, there are statements I cannot ethically ignore." Victoria fell silent, the full predicament finally settling over her. The careful plan she had constructed was disintegrating, leaving her with fewer options by the minute. "Here's what's going to happen," I said, surprising myself with my calm authority. "We're going to proceed with Dad's actual will. You'll receive your inheritance as he intended. What you do with it, whether you use it to help Charles or for something entirely different, is your decision. But the company stays intact. The employees keep their jobs, and Dad's home remains as he left it until I decide otherwise." I reached into my briefcase one final time, extracting the sealed letter Dad had left for Victoria. "Dad asked me to give you this after everything was settled. I think now is the right time." Victoria stared at the envelope, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I glimpsed the sister I had once known. Vulnerable, uncertain, human beneath the calculating exterior. She took the letter with uncharacteristic gentleness, slipping it into her bag without opening it. "Is there anything else required of me today?" she asked Harrison, her voice controlled but subdued. "Just your signature acknowledging the authentic will and withdrawing any contrary documents," he replied, sliding the necessary paperwork toward her. Victoria signed without further argument, her usual flourish absent from the signature. As she gathered her things to leave, she paused, not quite meeting my eyes. "He was always going to choose you," she said quietly. "From the beginning, it was always you." Before I could respond, she was gone, the door closing behind her with a soft click that somehow held more finality than any dramatic slam could have. Harrison exhaled slowly. That went better than I anticipated. Did it? I wasn't sure what I had expected. Tears, shouting, threats. But Victoria's quiet resignation felt somehow worse. A confirmation that the gulf between us had grown too wide to bridge. "Much better," Harrison confirmed. "She's realistic. Enough to recognize an unwinnable position." He began organizing the documents, his movements efficient. "The formal proceedings will take time, but with these materials, everything should be straightforward. Hanover Construction remains yours, as your father intended." I nodded, the victory feeling hollow despite its completeness. I had protected Dad's legacy, ensured the company's continuation, and secured my own future, but at the cost of whatever fragile family connection might have remained with Victoria. As I left Harrison's office, the weight of responsibility settled, more firmly on my shoulders. Dad had entrusted me with not just a business, but a purpose, to lead with the same integrity and vision that had built Hanover Construction from nothing. And perhaps, somehow, to eventually find a way to heal the family fracture that had grown so deep. The company was safe. The truth had prevailed. But the hardest part of Dad's legacy, finding a way to save Victoria from herself, remained unfulfilled. That challenge, I suspected, would prove more difficult than running any business. The following morning dawned with clarity I hadn't experienced since before Dad's diagnosis. For the first time in months, I woke without the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. The company was secure. Dad's true wishes would be honored. The employees who depended on Hanover Construction for their livelihoods could continue without disruption. Yet, as I prepared for my first day back at work since the funeral, I couldn't shake the image of Victoria's face as she left Harrison's office. The defeated posture, the careful composure masking what I now recognized as desperation. What had Dad written in that final letter to her? Would it heal anything, or merely deepen the wounds between us? These questions followed me as I drove to the Hanover Construction headquarters, a modest 2-story building Dad had purchased and renovated 15 years ago when the company outgrew its original location. The familiar sign out front, Hanover Construction, building tomorrow with yesterday's values, brought an unexpected tightness to my throat. Dad had insisted on that tagline, rejecting more modern alternatives from the marketing consultant. "People want to know what you stand for," he'd explained. "Our values are our foundation. Everything else is just decoration." The office fell silent when I walked in, conversations pausing mid-sentence as employees looked up from their desks. Melissa Chen, our office manager for the past decade, approached with a sympathetic smile. "Welcome back, Thomas," she said warmly. "We weren't sure when to expect you." "Thank you, Melissa. It's good to be back." I glanced around at the watching faces, some curious, others concerned. "Is everyone available for a quick meeting in the conference room? There are some things we should discuss." 20 minutes. Later, I stood at the head of the conference table where Dad had presided over countless meetings. All department heads and key personnel were present, their expressions ranging from apprehension to cautious optimism. "First, I want to thank everyone for keeping things running smoothly during Dad's illness and after his passing," I began. "Your dedication hasn't gone unnoticed." Appreciative nods circulated around the table, but the underlying tension remained. These people had mortgages, families, responsibilities. They needed certainty about their futures. "I know there have been rumors about the company's status and ownership," I continued. "I want to address those directly. Despite what some of you may have heard, Hanover Construction remains intact and operational. Dad maintained majority ownership, Until his death and under the terms of his will, that ownership has transferred to me. The relief in the room was palpable, a collective exhale that seemed to release weeks of accumulated anxiety. "So nothing's changing?" asked Robert Delgado, our project manager for commercial developments. "The Westridge Plaza project is still green-lighted?" "The project continues as planned," I confirmed. "In fact, all current projects and contracts remain in place. The transition will be one of leadership, not direction or values." More questions followed. Practical concerns about ongoing operations, scheduled bids, supplier relationships. I answered each one directly, gradually watching the worry lines ease from their faces. By the meeting's end, the atmosphere had transformed from anxious uncertainty to cautious optimism. As the team dispersed back to their responsibilities, Frank Carpenter appeared in the doorway. Unlike at the funeral, he was dressed in his usual work clothes, faded jeans, flannel shirt, the weathered leather tool belt he'd worn for as long as I could remember. "Got a minute?" he asked, nodding toward Dad's, now my, office. Inside, I took the chair behind the desk, somewhat hesitantly. It still felt like Dad's space, from the vintage construction blueprints framed on the walls to the collection of project photos documenting Hanover's growth over 3 decades. Frank settled into the visitor's chair, studying me with the same direct gaze that had always made me feel transparent. "So you found what Rich left for you," he said. It wasn't a question. I did. "How much did you know?" Frank shifted slightly. "Enough to deliver the message, not enough to interfere." He gestured around the office. "Looks like things are settling back where they belong." "Professionally, yes," I acknowledged. "The company's secure. But Victoria?" I trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the complicated mess of emotions surrounding my sister. "Complicated situation," Frank observed. "Your dad worried about her for years. You know, said she had so much of him in her, the drive, the ambition, but without the counterbalance." "Counterbalance?" "Your grandfather," Frank explained. "Rich's dad was a principled man, hard worker who believed success meant nothing if you compromised your integrity to get it. He died before you were born, but his influence on your father was profound." He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Victoria never had that influence. By the time she was forming her values, your mother was gone, and Rich was building the business. He provided financially but wasn't always present in the ways that mattered most." The observation wasn't new, but hearing it from Frank, who had known our family longer than anyone, gave it additional weight. "That doesn't excuse what she tried to do," I said, an edge creeping into my voice. "No, it doesn't," Frank agreed readily. "But understanding the why of something doesn't mean excusing it. It just gives you somewhere to start if you want to. Fix it." "I'm not sure it can be fixed," I admitted. "Or if Victoria even wants to try." Frank shrugged. "Maybe not. But Rich thought it was worth the attempt. That's why he left her that letter." "You know what it says?" I asked, surprised. "Not specifically, but I know your dad. He wouldn't have left things unsaid or unresolved if he could help it." Frank stood, adjusting his tool belt. "Anyway, I'm heading over to the Westridge site to check on the foundation work. Just wanted to stop by and see how you were settling in." After he left, I sat in Dad's chair, absorbing the familiar scents and sounds of the office. Coffee brewing in the break room, the hum of the HVAC system, Melissa's voice answering phones at the front desk. This had always been my second home, but now it carried a different weight. These weren't just spaces where I worked. They were my responsibility, my legacy to protect and grow. I was reaching for the stack of project reports waiting for review when my cell phone rang. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize. "Thomas Hanover," I answered, expecting a client or supplier. "Mr. Hanover, this is Nurse Shelby from Memorial Hospital." A professional female voice came through the line. "I'm calling about your sister, Victoria Reed." My grip tightened on the phone. "What about her?" "She asked me to contact you. She's been admitted following what appears to be an anxiety attack. She's stable now, but quite adamant about speaking with you." The request was so unexpected that for a moment I couldn't formulate a response. Victoria, who had always handled every crisis with cool detachment, having an anxiety attack severe enough for hospitalization. And asking for me, of all people. "Mr. Hanover, are you there?" "Yes. Sorry," I replied quickly. "Which floor is she on? I'll come right away." 20 minutes later, I stood outside room 412 of Memorial Hospital's West Wing, gathering my composure. Before entering. What would I say to the sister who had tried to steal my inheritance, who had manipulated our dying father, who now, inexplicably, had asked for me in a moment of vulnerability? I knocked softly and entered without waiting for a response. The private room was dimly lit. The afternoon sun filtered through partially closed blinds. Victoria lay in the hospital bed, an IV in one arm, her normally perfect appearance disheveled. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the institutional setting and the absence of her usual armor of designer clothes and impeccable grooming. She turned toward me, and I was struck by how much she suddenly resembled Dad. The same determined set of the jaw, the same direct gaze. "You came?" she said, her voice rougher than usual. "Of course I came." I moved to the visitor's chair beside her bed. "What happened?" Victoria attempted a dismissive gesture that the IV tube constrained. "Panic attack, apparently. Started at home after I—" She paused, then continued more deliberately. "After I read Dad's letter. Couldn't catch my breath. Charles called. An ambulance." The letter, of course. "Where is Charles now?" I asked, noticing his absence. "I sent him home. Told him I needed space." She adjusted her position, wincing slightly. "They gave me something for anxiety. Makes everything a bit fuzzy." An awkward silence stretched between us, filled with unspoken accusations and explanations, questions neither of us seemed ready to ask directly. Finally, Victoria spoke, her gaze fixed on the window rather than me. "Did you read it? Dad's letter to me?" "No," I assured her. "It was sealed. Private." She nodded, then reached for the small drawer in the bedside table, extracting the envelope I'd given her yesterday. The seal was broken. The paper crumpled slightly, as if it had been read multiple times, or perhaps crushed in a moment of emotion. "I think you should read it," she said quietly, holding it out. "Maybe then you'll understand." I hesitated, uncertain, about crossing this boundary. "Victoria, that's between you and Dad." "Please," she insisted, with none of her usual commanding tone. "I need you to know what he said." I accepted the envelope, carefully withdrawing the single sheet of paper covered in Dad's handwriting, steadier than in his final months, suggesting he'd written this earlier in his illness. "Victoria, if you're reading this, then two things have happened. I'm gone, and your attempts to circumvent my wishes have failed. I'm not writing to condemn you, though I won't pretend I wasn't deeply hurt by your actions. Instead, I want to tell you something I should have said years ago. Failed you as a father, not financially. I always provided for your material needs, but emotionally, in the ways that truly matter. After your mother left, I threw myself into the business, using work to escape my grief. Thomas was easier. He wanted to be where I was, doing what I was doing. You needed something different, something I didn't know how to give. Your intelligence, your ambition, your determination. These qualities mirror my own. But without proper guidance, strengths can become liabilities. I watched you build walls instead of bridges, pursue power instead of purpose, chase status instead of significance. I recognized the pattern because I'd nearly fallen into it myself. Before your grandfather set me straight. He taught me that a life measured only by accumulation of wealth, influence, or accomplishments is ultimately hollow. True wealth comes from what you build that serves others, from the positive impact you leave on lives around you. I tried to build Hanover Construction on that principle. I don't know what desperate circumstances drove you to the actions you took these past months. I suspect Charles is involved, and that the situation is serious. Whatever it is, betraying family and manipulating a dying man are not solutions that will bring you peace or resolution. The inheritance I've left you is substantial, though perhaps not what you hoped for. Use it wisely. More importantly, consider what legacy you want to leave beyond material possessions. It's not too late to redirect your considerable talents toward something meaningful. Thomas will protect and grow what I've built because he shares my vision for it. He has always understood that Hanover Construction isn't just about buildings. It's about creating structures that serve communities, providing stable employment, and practicing business with integrity. My deepest regret is that I couldn't. Find a way to bridge the distance between us before the end. Know that despite your recent actions, despite our differences, you have always been loved, not for your achievements or status, but simply because you are my daughter. Perhaps someday you'll understand that this letter, and my arrangements for the estate, weren't about depriving you, but about trying, one last time, to give you something of greater value than what you were attempting to take, with enduring love and hope for your future, Dad. I read the letter twice, emotions shifting with each passage. Anger at the confirmation of Victoria's deliberate deception, sorrow at Dad's acknowledgement of his parental shortcomings, hope in his continuing belief in Victoria's potential for redemption. When I finally looked up, Victoria was watching me intently, her expression more vulnerable than I had seen since we were children. "He knew," she said softly. "All along he knew what I was doing, and he still—" Her voice caught. "Still loved you," I finished. "Still believed you could be better than your worst decisions." Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "Charles's investment firm is under federal investigation. Client funds misappropriated, records falsified. He claimed it was temporary, just moving assets around to cover shortfalls until major investments paid off." She laughed bitterly. The classic justification for every financial fraud in history. "You knew?" I asked, trying to keep accusation from my tone. "Not at first. By the time I understood the full scope, I was implicated too. Signatures on documents, joint accounts, board positions I'd accepted without proper scrutiny." She met my eyes, directly. "I was trying to protect him, to protect myself. The Hanover assets would have provided enough liquidity to cover the immediate shortfalls while we sorted out the legal complications. At the expense of Dad's legacy, and my future," I pointed out, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Victoria didn't flinch from the accusation. "Yes, I justified it 1,000 ways. That you hadn't earned your position, that you were just Dad's favorite, that I deserved compensation for years of emotional distance." She shook her head slightly. "But ultimately, I was willing to sacrifice both of you to save myself. That's the truth Dad saw, even from his deathbed." Her frank admission was disarming. I had expected continued manipulation, not this raw honesty. "What happens now?" I asked. "With Charles? With the investigation?" "Charles doesn't know yet that I've been honest with you. He still thinks we can find a way out." She straightened, slightly in the bed, a glimmer of her usual determination returning. "But I've made my decision. Tomorrow I'm contacting the prosecutor handling the case. I'm going to negotiate whatever cooperation agreement I can." "That could mean serious consequences," I said carefully, "for both of you." "Yes," she acknowledged. "But Dad was right. Some paths lead nowhere worth going, no matter how desperate the circumstances." She gestured toward the letter I still held. I spent my life believing Dad favored you because you were easier to love. Now I understand he was trying to protect me from myself, even at the end. The admission hung between us, creating an opening where there had only been walls before. Not reconciliation, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of honesty that might someday lead there. Victoria, I said finally, whatever happens with the legal situation, you're still my sister. Still. Family. Her eyes widened slightly, skepticism evident. Even after what I tried to do? Even after that, I confirmed. Dad spent his life building things meant to last. That includes family, however complicated ours might be. For the first time in years, perhaps decades, I saw genuine emotion break through Victoria's carefully maintained facade. Not calculation or manipulation, but something authentic struggling to the surface. I don't deserve that kind of second chance, she said quietly. Maybe not, I agreed. But Dad believed in building on solid foundations, not tearing down what could still be salvaged. I think he'd want me to at least try. Victoria didn't respond immediately, but something shifted in her expression. A softening, a momentary lowering of defenses that had been maintained for a lifetime. Whatever path lay ahead, for Hanover construction, for Victoria's legal situation, for our fractured family bonds, would begin with this moment of truth. Not an easy reconciliation, but the first honest exchange we'd had in years. Dad's legacy, I was beginning to understand, involved much more than a company or material assets. It was about the values that would guide our choices moving forward, the foundations upon which we might, with time and effort, build something that truly endured. The following weeks unfolded with the methodical precision of a well-planned construction project. Each day brought new developments, challenges, and decisions that required my full attention. Leading Hanover construction, while navigating the aftermath of Victoria's revelations, tested every skill Dad had taught me over the years. Victoria had been true to her word. The day after our hospital conversation, she contacted federal prosecutors to negotiate a cooperation agreement. Her attorney, not Harrison Fleming, but a specialist in white-collar defense, kept me informed of developments as a professional courtesy. The news was sobering, but not unexpected. Charles faced multiple felony charges for investment fraud and misappropriation of client funds. Victoria, through her cooperation and lack of direct involvement in the firm's operations, might avoid prison time, but still faced significant legal consequences. The local business community buzzed with rumors. Our small city, where everyone knew everyone else's business, couldn't help but speculate about the sudden fall of Charles Reed, whose investment firm had managed portfolios for many prominent families. Some clients withdrew projects from Hanover Construction, uncomfortable with even a tangential connection to financial impropriety. Others doubled down on their support, having known Dad's integrity for decades and trusting that the company remained true to his principles. Through it all, I maintained a steady course, focusing on what Dad had always emphasized: quality work, ethical business practices, and taking care of our employees. Each morning before dawn, I reviewed project status, reports. Each evening after the office emptied, I studied financial statements and growth projections. The responsibility was enormous, but so was my determination to prove worthy of Dad's faith in me. 3 weeks after Victoria's hospitalization, I received an unexpected visitor at the office. The day had been particularly challenging. A key supplier had backed out of a major project, citing concerns about company stability, and I'd spent hours securing an alternative source for specialized materials. It was nearly 7 in the evening when Melissa buzzed my office. "Thomas, there's someone here to see you. No appointment." I suppressed a sigh of frustration. "Who is it?" "Eleanor Adams. Says she was a friend of your father's." The name was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't immediately place it. "Send her in, please." The woman who entered was in her early 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair and the confident bearing of someone comfortable in her own skin. She wore simple but elegant business attire and carried a leather portfolio that had seen considerable. Ausdaught, Mr. Hanover. She greeted me with a firm handshake. Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I know you must be extraordinarily busy. Please call me Thomas, I replied, gesturing toward the visitor's chair. You knew my father? She smiled, settling into the seat. Richard and I worked together for many years. I was the lead architect on some of Hanover Construction's most significant projects before I started my own firm in Portland about 12 years ago. The connection clicked into place. The Adams Group. Of course. Dad always spoke highly of your innovative designs. And I always appreciated his commitment to executing those designs without cutting corners, she replied. She placed her portfolio on the desk, but didn't immediately open it. I've been following the situation with your family business, the rumors, the challenges. I stiffened slightly. If you're concerned about Hanover Construction's stability, she waved off my concern. Not at all. I know Richard built this company on a foundation stronger than temporary difficulties. I'm here because of a conversation we had about 6 months ago, when his illness took a turn for the worse. This was unexpected. You spoke with Dad during his illness? Eleanor nodded. We kept in touch over the years, consulting occasionally on special projects. When he received his prognosis, he called me with a specific request. She finally opened her portfolio, extracting a set of architectural renderings. He commissioned these designs, but asked me to hold them until after his passing, until things had settled. She spread the renderings across my desk. They showed a striking modern building complex, 3 interconnected structures surrounding a central courtyard, with extensive green spaces and sustainable design elements. What is this? I asked, studying the detailed plans. The Richard Hanover Center for Construction Trades, Eleanor explained. A training facility to provide education in all aspects of the building trades, from traditional craftsmanship to cutting-edge sustainable construction methods. Designed to serve both young people entering the field and older workers transitioning from declining industries. I looked up from the renderings, momentarily speechless. Dad had never mentioned such a project. Eleanor continued. Richard was concerned about the future of skilled trades in our region. He saw fewer young people entering construction, more experienced craftspeople retiring, and a growing skills gap that threatened the quality and safety of the built environment. She tapped one of the drawings. This center would address that gap, creating pathways to stable, well-paying careers while upholding the standards of excellence he valued. This would be significant, I managed, taking in the scope of the project. The investment required is substantial, Eleanor acknowledged. Richard had a specific funding mechanism in mind. She extracted another document from her portfolio, a financial analysis prepared by a respected local accounting firm. He had been quietly setting aside funds in a separate foundation for years, specifically earmarked for this purpose. The foundation now holds approximately 60% of the required capital. The rest would need to come from community partners, industry supporters, and possibly a matching contribution from Hanover Construction over time. My mind raced, simultaneously processing the practical implications and the emotional weight of this discovery. Even as his health failed, Dad had been planning for the future, not just of our company, but of the entire field he had dedicated his life to. Why didn't he tell me about this? I asked, the question directed as much to myself as to Eleanor. Her expression softened with understanding. He wanted to, many times. But as his condition worsened, family complications took precedence. She didn't need to mention Victoria explicitly. We both understood the reference. He asked me to wait until you had fully assumed leadership and navigated the immediate transition. He didn't want to burden you with another major decision during an already difficult time. I studied the renderings again, noticing details that clearly reflected Dad's values and vision: practical learning spaces, areas dedicated to traditional craftsmanship, innovations in sustainable building technologies. The project wasn't just about construction skills. It was about perpetuating an approach to building that prioritized quality, integrity, and community impact. This would be his legacy, I said softly, beyond the company itself. Eleanor nodded. That's exactly how he described it. A way to pass on not just technical skills, but the philosophy that guided his work. That good construction improves lives, creates community, and should stand the test of time in both structural integrity and purpose. The timing of this revelation felt significant. Just as I was finding my footing at Hanover Construction's helm, just as the immediate crisis with Victoria was being addressed, this new possibility emerged: an opportunity to extend Dad's vision in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'll need time to review everything in detail, I said, gathering the documents carefully, to understand the full scope and implications before making any decisions. Of course, Eleanor agreed, standing to leave. Richard expected nothing less. He always said you had not just his determination, but his thoroughness. The perfect combination for someone entrusted with building something meant to last. After she departed, I remained at my desk long into the evening, reviewing every aspect of the proposed center. The financial analysis was sound, the architectural concept both practical and inspiring. Dad had thought through the details with characteristic care, creating a framework that could be implemented without compromising Hanover Construction's ongoing operations. As midnight approached, I found myself drawn to the personal letter Eleanor had included with the formal documents, Dad's explanation of his vision for the center, written in his own hand during his final months. Thomas, by now you've seen the plans for the Center for Construction Trades. This project represents my attempt to address a challenge I've watched grow throughout my career: the diminishing pool of skilled craftspeople who understand that construction is both a science and an art, requiring not just technical knowledge, but dedication to excellence. I started Hanover Construction with a simple belief that how we build matters as much as what we build, that cutting corners may save money today but costs more tomorrow, that true craftsmanship creates value that appreciates rather than depreciates over time. These principles are increasingly rare in an industry driven by speed and profit margins. Each year, I've found it harder to find workers who understand the difference between doing a job and doing it right. Not because people don't want to learn, but because fewer have the opportunity to master these skills under proper guidance. The center would change that, creating a place where traditional knowledge is preserved and passed on, where innovation is taught alongside time-tested methods, where the next generation can develop both the skills and the values that make construction a noble profession. I considered making this my final directive to you, an obligation rather than an option. But that wouldn't be fair. You've earned the right to lead Hanover Construction according to your own judgment, to determine its future course based on your assessment of what's right for the company and community. So I present this not as a command, but as a possibility. An opportunity to extend what we've built together beyond the life of any single building or business. A chance to create something that will continue educating and inspiring long after both of us are gone. Whatever you decide, know that my confidence in you has never wavered. From the moment you picked up your first hammer, I saw in you not just aptitude but understanding, the recognition that we build not just with materials but with principles, not just for clients, but for communities, not just for today, but for generations to come. With pride and love, Dad reading his words, I felt a renewed connection to Dad, not just as my father or mentor, but as someone whose vision extended far beyond his own lifetime. He had built Hanover Construction not as a monument to himself, but as a vehicle for values he believed would benefit others long after he was gone. The revelation changed something fundamental in my understanding of leadership. I had been focused on preserving what Dad had created, maintaining the status quo he had established. But his true legacy wasn't static. It was dynamic, not just a business to be protected, but a vision to be expanded. The Richard Hanover Center represented something larger than either of us, a commitment to excellence that wouldn't end with a single company or career, but could continue influencing how homes, offices, schools, and communities were built for decades to come. As I finally left the office in the early hours of the morning, the weight of responsibility I'd been carrying felt different. No lighter, perhaps, but more purposeful. I wasn't just the caretaker of Dad's company, I was the steward of his vision, tasked not only with preserving what he had built, but with extending it in ways that would multiply its impact. The challenge was daunting, but clarifying. For the first time since Dad's passing, I felt not just obligation, but inspiration, a sense of purpose that transcended the day-to-day operations of running a construction company. Dad's hidden will had secured my legal right to lead Hanover Construction. But his hidden vision, this center that would embody and perpetuate his values, had given me something even more valuable, a clear direction forward that honored the past while building toward the future. This was the true inheritance, not just assets to manage, but a vision to fulfill, not just a company to run, but a legacy to extend, not just a business to maintain, but a purpose to pursue. For the first time since becoming Hanover Construction's leader, I felt fully equal to the role, not because I had all the answers, but because I now understood the deeper question that would guide every decision. How could we build not just structures, but a better future? The Richard Hanover Center for Construction Trades couldn't have come at a more pivotal time for our community. 3 major manufacturing plants had announced closures in the past year, leaving hundreds of skilled workers unemployed. The regional economy, long dependent on these industries, faced an uncertain future. Meanwhile, the construction sector struggled with an aging workforce and insufficient new talent entering the field. I spent the next 2 weeks developing a comprehensive implementation plan for the center. Each morning before the office opened, I reviewed architectural plans and financial projections. During lunch breaks, I researched similar training facilities across the country, identifying best practices and potential pitfalls. Evenings were dedicated to drafting partnership proposals and community impact assessments. The more I explored the concept, the more I recognized its transformative potential, not just for Hanover Construction, but for the entire region. This wasn't merely a training facility, it was an economic development engine, a community resource, and a living testament to Dad's belief that business success and social responsibility could reinforce rather than compete with each other. When the preliminary plan was ready, I faced a critical decision. Who should be the first to review it? The obvious choice was the Hanover Construction executive team, the department heads who had worked alongside Dad for years and now reported to me. Their buy-in would be essential for any initiative that would involve company resources. But another possibility nagged at me, one that seemed simultaneously reckless and necessary. Before I could second-guess my instinct, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I rarely used. "Hello?" Victoria's voice sounded guarded, unsurprising given our complicated history. "Victoria, it's Thomas. I was hoping we could meet. There's something important I'd like to discuss with you." A pause then. "Is this about the legal proceedings?" "No, nothing like that. It's about something Dad was planning before he died. Something significant." Another pause, longer this time. "When and where?" We arranged to meet the following afternoon at a small cafe on the outskirts of town, neutral territory, away from prying eyes and the gossip network that had been closely monitoring the Hanover family drama. I arrived early, securing a quiet corner table and arranging the key documents I wanted to share. Victoria entered precisely on time, her appearance a study in dignified caution. Gone were the designer labels and status symbols that had once been her uniform. Instead, She wore a simple blazer over jeans, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. The change wasn't just cosmetic. Her entire demeanor seemed different, less calculated, more authentic. "Thank you for coming," I said as she took the seat across from me. "I was curious," she admitted. "And to be honest, I don't have many appointments these days." The subtle reference to her changed circumstances hung between us. Since the news about Charles's firm had broken, Victoria had resigned from her position on the City Arts Commission and stepped back from the social circles she had once dominated. Charles himself was now awaiting trial, released on bail but effectively under house arrest with electronic monitoring. "How are you holding up?" I asked, genuine concern overriding the lingering tension between us. Victoria considered the question with unexpected candor. "Some days are harder than others. The legal bills are astronomical. Most of our so-called friends have disappeared. The prosecutor's office is demanding more documentation than I knew existed." She shrugged slightly. "But there's a strange kind of relief in having everything exposed. No more secrets, no more pretending." "And Charles?" Her expression tightened. "Angry, betrayed. Blames me for cooperating with the investigation instead of fighting alongside him. And we're living in the same house but barely speaking." She glanced at the folder in front of me. "But I assume you didn't invite me here to discuss my crumbling marriage." "No," I agreed, opening the folder to reveal Eleanor Adams's architectural renderings. "I wanted to show you this." Victoria leaned forward, studying the drawings with the sharp, analytical mind that had always been one of her greatest strengths. Her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine curiosity as she examined each page. "The Richard Hanover Center for Construction Trades," she read from the cover sheet. "When did Dad commission this?" "About 6 months ago, after his diagnosis. He kept it confidential. I only learned about it last week when his architect approached me." I explained the concept in detail: the educational programs, the community partnerships, the funding structure Dad had established. Victoria listened without interruption, her focus intense as she absorbed each element of the plan. "This is impressive," she finally said, looking up from the financial projections. "It addresses real needs in the community while building on Dad's expertise and values. The partial funding through the foundation is strategically sound." Her assessment was exactly right. Clinical but perceptive, immediately grasping both the practical and philosophical dimensions of the project. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked directly. "I no longer have any role in Hanover construction." This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the reason I'd followed my instinct: to involve Victoria despite our complicated history. "Because I think you should be part of it," I said simply. Her surprise was evident. "Me? Thomas, have you forgotten the past few months? What I tried to do?" "I haven't forgotten," I assured her. "But I've been thinking about Dad's letter to you, about his regret that your talents weren't directed toward something meaningful, something aligned with his values." Victoria flinched slightly at the reference but didn't object. "This center will need more than construction expertise to succeed," I continued. "It will need someone who understands policy, who can navigate governmental partnerships, who knows how to build community support and manage stakeholder relationships. Someone with your experience and skills." She studied me with open skepticism. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm proposing a collaboration," I clarified. "A defined role with the foundation that will oversee the center's development and operation. Independence from Hanover Construction's direct management, but alignment with its values and goals." Victoria sat back, visibly processing the unexpected proposal. "Why would you trust me with this, after everything that happened?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly while developing this plan. The answer had emerged gradually, crystallized through reflection on Dad's approach to both business and family. Dad believed in second chances, I explained. Not naively or without accountability, but with clear expectations and appropriate boundaries. He built Hanover Construction by recognizing potential in people and situations that others overlooked or dismissed. I paused, choosing my next words carefully. Your actions hurt him deeply. They hurt me too. But they don't erase your capabilities, or the possibility that those capabilities could be directed towards something worthwhile. Victoria's composed exterior cracked slightly, a fleeting vulnerability crossing her features before she regained control. And this role, it would involve what, exactly? I outlined the position I envisioned: Director of External Affairs for the Richard Hanover Foundation, responsible for building partnerships with educational institutions, government agencies, and industry associations. The role would utilize her political acumen and relationship-building skills while keeping her removed from financial management, a necessary boundary given recent events. The salary would be modest compared to what you're accustomed to, I acknowledged, and there would be conditions: regular reporting to the foundation board, transparent communication, graduated responsibility as trust is established. Victoria listened with growing engagement, occasionally asking incisive questions about governance structure, funding mechanisms, and performance metrics. Her analytical mind was already working on the challenge, seeing possibilities and connections I hadn't considered. You've clearly thought this through, she noted after I finished my explanation. But have you considered how this will look to others? The business community, your employees, the public? Thomas Hanover hires disgraced sister despite attempted inheritance theft isn't exactly a headline that inspires confidence. I have considered it, I confirmed. And yes, there will be skeptics. But Dad never made decisions based primarily on public perception. He evaluated options based on their alignment with his values and their potential for positive impact. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze directly. This isn't about repairing our relationship, Victoria. It's about honoring Dad's belief that talents should be directed toward meaningful work. It's about creating something that serves others rather than just ourselves. If you're not interested, I understand. But if you are... I'm interested, she said quietly, surprising me with her immediacy. More than interested. I'm grateful for the opportunity. She touched the architectural renderings with unexpected gentleness. I've spent months focused on what I nearly destroyed. The chance to build something instead, something that would make Dad proud, is more appealing than I can adequately express. The vulnerability in her voice was so uncharacteristic that I momentarily struggled for response. This wasn't the calculated Victoria I had faced across Harrison Fleming's office, or even the defensive Victoria from the hospital room. This was someone I hadn't seen in decades, the sister who had once shared dreams and plans before life and choices drove us in different directions. There would be challenges, I cautioned, recovering my professional demeanor. Skepticism to overcome, trust to rebuild, complicated dynamics to navigate. I'm well acquainted with challenges, Victoria replied with a hint of her old confidence. And I've recently had ample opportunity to reflect on the difference between using skills to take and using them to contribute. She straightened in her chair. I'd like to review the complete proposal before making a formal commitment. Approach this properly with due diligence on both sides. Her response was reasonable and measured, another departure from the impulsive opportunism that had characterized her recent actions. I handed her a folder containing the detailed implementation plan, budget projections, and proposed governance structure. Take your time, I told her. This isn't a decision to rush, but if you decide to proceed, we would begin with a probationary period. Clear expectations, defined deliverables, regular evaluation. Victoria accepted the folder with unexpected humility. That's more than fair, more than I deserve, honestly. As we prepared to leave, Victoria paused, setting her hand briefly on the architectural renderings still spread across the table. He always did think bigger than anyone else, she observed quietly. Everyone saw a construction company. He saw a vehicle for creating something lasting, something that mattered. She met my eyes with rare directness. Thank you for seeing me as more than my worst decisions. The acknowledgement caught me off guard. Dad would say that's what real construction is about, building on solid foundation even after structural damage, restoration rather than demolition when the core remains sound. For the first time in our adult lives, Victoria and I shared a moment of genuine connection, not agreement necessarily, but mutual recognition of a truth larger than our individual perspectives. Dad's approach to both buildings and people had always prioritized potential over problems, strength over damage, future function over past failure. As we parted ways outside the cafe, I realized this proposal represented more than a strategic business decision. It was an application of Dad's philosophy, his belief that with proper design, appropriate materials, and skilled execution, most damaged structures could be not just repaired, but strengthened. The Richard Hanover Center for Construction Trades would teach technical skills to future builders, but its development might also demonstrate something equally valuable: that broken relationships, like compromised buildings, could sometimes be reconstructed with sufficient vision, appropriate boundaries, and careful, intentional work. Whether Victoria would ultimately prove worthy of this second chance remained to be seen, but offering the opportunity aligned with Dad's deepest values. His conviction that how we build matters as much as what we build, whether we're constructing buildings, businesses, or the more complicated architecture of human relationships. As I drove back to the office, I felt a growing certainty that Dad would have approved of this approach, not because it guaranteed success, but because it embodied the principles of thoughtful construction he had lived by. Begin with a clear vision. Build on solid foundation. Use appropriate materials. Establish proper structural supports. Test thoroughly before completing. Maintain with ongoing attention. The center would be his namesake, but its development might become his most meaningful legacy, a living demonstration that with the right blueprint, even the most damaged structures could be transformed into something strong, functional, and built to last. News travels quickly in small communities, and our town was no exception. Within days of my meeting with Victoria, whispers about the proposed collaboration reached the executive team at Hanover Construction. By the following Monday morning, the tension in the office was palpable. Sideways glances during conversations, hushed discussions that stopped when I approached, an undercurrent of concern that threatened the stability I'd worked so hard to maintain. I'd anticipated some resistance but underestimated its intensity. When Robert Delgado, our senior project manager, requested a private meeting, I knew the situation could no longer be ignored. "Thomas, do you have a moment?" Robert stood in my doorway, his usual confident demeanor replaced by cautious formality. "Of course, Robert. Come in." He closed the door behind him, a clear sign this wasn't a routine discussion about project timelines or material supplies. Robert had been with Hanover Construction for 23 years, rising from apprentice carpenter to managing our largest commercial projects. Dad had trusted him implicitly, often saying Robert's commitment to quality was carved from the same wood as his own. "I'll get straight to the point," Robert began, taking the chair across from my desk. "There's talk about Victoria being involved in the new training center. People are concerned." "I appreciate your directness," I replied, maintaining a calm exterior despite the defensive reaction rising within me. "Yes, I've proposed a specific role for Victoria with the foundation that will oversee the center's development, not with Hanover Construction directly." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Thomas, with all due respect to your family situation, your sister tried to take control of this company out from under you. She manipulated your father during his illness. If it weren't for his foresight, We might all be unemployed right now while she liquidated everything for quick cash. His assessment wasn't inaccurate, which made it all the more difficult to address. I took a measured breath before responding. You're right about what Victoria attempted. The facts aren't in dispute. What we're discussing now is whether someone with her particular skills could make a valuable contribution to the center's development, with appropriate safeguards and oversight. Robert's expression remained skeptical. This isn't just my concern. The entire management team is worried. We've spent weeks reassuring clients, suppliers, and employees that Hanover Construction remains stable and trustworthy despite the family complications. Bringing Victoria into a closely associated foundation undermines that message. He wasn't wrong. The company had weathered significant reputational challenges following the public revelation of Victoria's actions and Charles's legal troubles. We'd worked diligently to distance Hanover Construction from the scandal, emphasizing continuity and stability under my leadership. I understand the concerns, I acknowledged. They're legitimate and worth serious consideration, but I'd like to explain my reasoning before conclusions are drawn. For the next 30 minutes, I outlined the strategic thinking behind the proposal. Victoria's experience with governmental partnerships and community relations, the clear separation between operational roles, the accountability structures that would prevent any financial impropriety. Robert listened attentively, his initial resistance gradually shifting to thoughtful consideration. You've clearly done your homework, he conceded when I finished. But there's something I'm still not understanding. Why take the risk at all? We could hire someone with similar qualifications who doesn't bring this kind of baggage. It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of my decision. The practical answer wasn't sufficient. This wasn't just about skills and qualifications. But the personal answer risked seeming sentimental or naive in a business context. I glanced at the photograph on my desk. Dad and me at the groundbreaking for the Westridge Medical Center, our most ambitious project to date. His expression captured exactly what had made him extraordinary. Pride in achievement, balanced with humility about the work yet to be done. Robert, do you remember what Dad used to say about salvaging historic buildings that others wanted to demolish? A small smile touched his face. That it's always easier to tear down than to restore, but rarely better in the long run. Exactly. He believed that with the right approach, most structures could be saved, that beneath damaged exteriors, there was often solid material worth preserving. I leaned forward, choosing my words carefully. Victoria has made serious mistakes. She betrayed family trust and acted in ways that could have destroyed what Dad built. But her abilities themselves aren't the problem. It was how she directed them. Robert nodded slowly, beginning to understand where I was headed. Dad left her a letter, I continued. In it, he expressed regret that he hadn't helped direct her talents toward something meaningful, something that aligned with his values. This proposal is partly about honoring that wish, giving her an opportunity to redirect her capabilities toward construction rather than destruction. That sounds like your father, Robert admitted. He always saw potential where others saw problems. He considered for a moment. But Richard also wasn't naive about structural integrity. He wouldn't preserve a building that couldn't be safely restored, regardless of its historical value. You're absolutely right, I agreed. And this isn't about blind trust or family sentiment. It's about calculated risk with appropriate safeguards. Victoria would have no access to Hanover Construction finances, no authority over company decisions, and a clearly defined role within a foundation governed by an independent board. Robert didn't immediately respond, weighing my explanation against his understandable concerns. Finally, he sighed. I can't say I'm completely convinced, but I respect that you've thought this through from multiple angles. He stood, signaling the conversation was concluding. The team would appreciate hearing directly from you about this. Transparency would go a long way toward addressing concerns. I'll call a management meeting for tomorrow morning, I promised. Full disclosure, open discussion. After Robert left, I remained at my desk, contemplating the challenge ahead. His reaction was just the beginning. The executive team would have similar reservations, likely more forcefully expressed by some. Beyond them, employees, clients, suppliers, and community partners would all form opinions about this decision, potentially impacting their relationship with Hanover Construction. Was I risking Dad's legacy to satisfy some misplaced sense of family obligation? The question had haunted me since conceptualizing Victoria's potential role. But each time I revisited the decision, I returned to the same conclusion. Offering Victoria this opportunity, with appropriate boundaries and expectations, aligned with Dad's fundamental approach to both business and life. The management meeting. The following morning was exactly as challenging as anticipated. I presented the complete implementation plan for the Richard Hanover Center, including the proposed governance structure and Victoria's potential role. The initial response was skeptical silence, followed by increasingly direct questions. How can we be certain she won't use this position to undermine your leadership? Asked Melissa Chen, our operations director. What happens when clients express concern about her involvement? Questioned James Wilson from Business Development. Isn't this sending mixed messages about accountability? Challenged Elena Rodriguez, our Chief Financial Officer. I addressed each concern directly, neither minimizing their validity nor defensively dismissing them. The discussion was pointed but professional, reflecting the team's genuine investment in Hanover Construction's future rather than personal animosity toward Victoria. As the conversation progressed, an unexpected ally emerged. Frank Carpenter, who rarely attended management meetings despite his senior status, spoke up from the back of the room. I've known the Hanover family for over 30 years, he began, his gravelly voice commanding immediate attention. Worked alongside Rich building this company when it was just the two of us and a used pickup truck. Watched Thomas grow from a kid who couldn't drive a straight nail to the leader sitting before you. He paused, surveying the room. I've also known Victoria since she was born. Watched her pull away from her father's values, chase status instead of substance. What she did these past months was inexcusable, a betrayal of everything Rich stood for. The room remained silent, everyone aware that Frank wasn't finished. But Rich Hanover believed in second chances, not handed out carelessly, but earned through demonstration of changed priorities and acceptance of consequences. Frank's weathered face creased in a slight smile. How many of you got second chances from Rich over the years, made mistakes that would have gotten you fired elsewhere, but instead got redirected? Several heads nodded in reluctant acknowledgement. Thomas isn't proposing we forget what happened or pretend it didn't matter. He's proposing a structured opportunity for Victoria to demonstrate whether she's capable of contributing rather than taking. With safeguards, supervision, and clear expectations. Frank looked directly at me. Sounds exactly like something his father would have designed. The endorsement from Dad's oldest friend and colleague shifted the energy in the room, not to wholehearted support, but to thoughtful consideration rather than reflexive opposition. The discussion that followed focused more on implementation details than on wholesale rejection of the concept. By meeting's end, we had reached a compromise. Victoria's potential involvement would begin with a 6-month consulting contract rather than an immediate directorship. Her performance would be evaluated against specific metrics by a committee including both Foundation board members and Hanover Construction representatives. Any continuation beyond that initial period would depend on demonstrated results and rebuilt trust. It wasn't unconditional acceptance, but it wasn't outright rejection either. It was a measured, professional approach to a complex situation, exactly the kind of balanced decision-making Dad had modeled throughout his career. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.